Well, hello, everybody. My name is Taylor Bucksbaum. I'm a director of development at Arkansas State University. I want to welcome you to our Lunch and Learn session today, hosted by the Arkansas State University Alumni Association. Today, we are featuring a panel discussion with our School of Media and Journalism about information hygiene. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Brad Rawlins. He's a professor and the director of the School of Media and Journalism here at Arkansas State University. Brad, thank you for joining us today. I want to pass it over to you. Won't you introduce the folks that you've got on the panel with you today?
Very good. Thank you very much, Taylor. We're really happy to be able to offer this Lunch and Learn today. I think media literacy is something that's very important today and becoming more important in all of our lives. Joining me for this discussion is Dr. Ron Sitten. Ron joined us a number of years ago as a faculty member, teaches in our multimedia journalism program, where he also set up our Delta Digital News Service here within our program, a student media lab that provides news and information to the Delta region. He has several years of print journalism experience and many more years of teaching. Also joining me is Lars Roberts. He's also a faculty member of our multimedia journalism program. Teaches primarily in the broadcast area, has a lot of radio experience that he brings with him and television experience as well. So he's the faculty advisor for our Red Wolf Radio and for our ASU TV news production. So with our collective experience in both teaching about media and our experiences within media, I've been teaching particularly topics related to media literacy for nearly 30 years. We wanted to share with you some ideas about information hygiene, which is kind of a fairly new term, and media literacy, hopefully to help us continue to move forward with our democracy. I've been reading a book recently. I've shared this with both Ron and Lars. It's a book that a colleague of mine at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas sent me. It's called An Aristocracy of Critics. It's about the Hutchins Commission. Hutchins Commission was a commission that was put together by Henry Luce, who was the publisher of Time, Life, and Fortune magazines, and ultimately became one of the largest publishers in the world. He funded a committee to look at the responsibility of the press in the 1940s, and it was chaired by Robert Hutchins, who was at the time the president of the University of Chicago. He put together a group of very thoughtful, well-respected individuals to talk about what was the responsibility of the media at that time. I want to read just something quickly from the preface of that book because I think it's fascinating. The author, who is Stephen Bates, writes that one of the reasons that Luce wanted to create this commission is because there was a lot of things happening at the time in the 1940s. It says newsroom bias, distrust of media, foreign and domestic propaganda, corporate domination of political discourse, a fragmenting and polarized electorate, hate speech, demagoguery, and as well as what we now call echo chambers, trolls, deplatforming, and post-truth politics were all things happening in the 1940s. So, anybody who studies history always says, history always repeats itself, right? We find ourselves in this exact same situation today with a lot of similarities to what was happening in the 1940s. The Hutchins Commission then wrote a report called A Free and Responsible Press and really established the the idea or the principle of media, particularly news media, having an obligation to society, that there are certain ethical guidelines and principles that it should be abide by, that there should be professional training for journalists, and that that they should live up to the promise or the promise of the First Amendment right of a free speech. So we know that today we are experiencing a lot of distrust. There's a survey that's done every year by a company called Edelman. called the Edelman Trust Barometer. If anybody on the audience wants to look at this a little bit more, it's just EDELMAN, Edelman Trust Barometer. Just type in Edelman and Trust into Google, you'll find it. It is now finding that trust in all of our institutions is at an all-time low. Trust in government, trust in media, trust in corporations, trust in everything is at an all-time low. And so particularly trust in news and information and sources. I'm just going to share, if you don't mind, I'm going to share something real quick here that will show this. So you can see here, this is trust in all information sources is now at record lows. So whereas search engines and traditional media had been above the trust plateau for a few years, they're now below the trust plateau. Owned media, which is media that are owned by companies like A-State's website, would be an example of owned media. Any company that you might work for oftentimes has its own media websites, Facebook page, etc. And then social media is way low. And so we're seeing, there's just no trust whatsoever in the sources of information that we get. So we want to talk a little bit about the concept of information hygiene, which I think if we all practice our better information hygiene, we can begin to cultivate once again a culture of trust for information. And I'm not talking about information that has to come just from traditional media, but the danger of our society today is that there's a lack of trust in almost any kind of information. It doesn't matter where it's coming from. And it's very difficult for a democracy to govern itself if we can't trust information that we're getting that we use to make decisions within our democracy. So, so information hygiene is four things, and we're going to go over each of those four things with Dr. Sitton and Professor Roberts. But the information hygiene is four points to it. News engagement, which is staying informed. Avoiding echo chambers. In other words, being exposed to different points of view. Verifying information, fact-checking your stories from more than one source. And then finally, not amplifying unvetted information. So I'm going to throw the first question out to Dr. Sitton. In your opinion and your experience, how do we stay, what does news engagement mean, and how do we stay more informed as participants in this democracy?
Okay. To truly be engaged with your news, you need to see a lot of different sources. It's not just going to the same sources again and again. Typically, if you see something, or rather than saying you, I'll say me. When I see something that's questionable, when I see something that's attacking someone, when I see something that's it seems as though there must be, somebody's got a bias behind this. The first thing I do is to see if I'm finding that same information on multiple sites, or if it is just on one site. Typically, the way news happens is you typically get the same stories on many different sites, even though they may take slightly different angles. It's still the same topic of what's happening that day. If there is some sort of a controversial quote, you can go to Google, for example, or I prefer DuckDuckGo to, and Google the quote and search for the quote. Is that the only place that's showing it, or is it showing up someplace else? And then, if there's a picture that's even questionable, Google now has a search engine for photographs that you can literally upload it to see, if you're finding that picture in other places, or is there a possibility that it's been manipulated? So coming back to just news engagement generally, staying informed is a matter of not relying on just one source, but trying to find out as many different angles of this as possible. And it's a lot harder than it used to be. For example, the newspapers, when I was a kid, you used to have the Arkansas Democrat, you had the Arkansas Gazette for statewide news. If you wanted to find out what was happening, you read both, and then you read between the lines, and you could have a pretty good idea of what was going on. But we have gotten to a point now where there are so many places that have, just one source of news in their town, and it makes it more difficult to truly stay informed because you have to dig a lot harder. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, if I can piggyback on that, a major part of what you would call literacy is to make a distinction between what you call news content and commentary. A lot of people don't think critically because a lot of it's going to be dressed up alike. You have those who will put forth commentary content, but they'll look like a news anchor or they'll make it look like a news article. And for those who aren't, especially if it echoes an opinion or a fact that they think is true already, and it confirms that, okay, it kind of looks like news content is saying something that I may think already, or it says something against what I think already. So that becomes a bit blurred, especially now that we have so many different options. And you have there's no such thing as a news cycle anymore. No. It's 24 hours, it's instantaneous. So, what is news content versus what is commentary? And then you have, sometimes they're mixed together. So if you're not thinking critically, as well as, and I want to really give an amen to what you're saying, anything that comes across news, no one should be looking at just one news source and saying, this is where I get all of my information, because quite frankly, you're going to be at the mercy of whoever the shot callers are in that particular news outlet.
So the question I have is, and Lars, I'll toss this one back to you first, because your areas in the broadcast media. How do we distinguish, as you mentioned, news versus commentary? All of the 24-hour, 24/7 cable news networks no longer have news divisions. They eliminated their news division. CNN does not have a news division. Fox News does not have a news division. So they're not actually necessarily going out and gathering news. What a lot of it, of course, is trying to contextualize the news that they are getting, right? They'll send reporters out to events, particularly we tend to see reporters participating in events that are happening, very visual events that are happening, right? And the emotional impact that visual event happens. But what steps do we need to take to be more engaged in news and information if I just turn on the television or if I just pop up my Facebook page, I just might be getting, mostly opinion and context and the attempts to contextualizing information rather than the actual facts and figures themselves.
I would say, in addition to getting your information from more than one source, develop a pretty good filter. Once they break the news story and they give you all the information, and a lot of times they'll spend the next 3 hours analyzing and contextualizing and giving opinion. Filter some of that stuff out. Give me the who, what, when, why, where, how, and who cares. Make it relevant. But I've over my experience in my years, I can almost smell when they flip a switch and they start to get away from the story and putting in their personal 2 cents. Mm-hmm. Not to say that it's going to be totally stripped away. Okay, those reporters, those editors, those news directors, those producers, they are people. And just having to identify which stories are going to be a part of the news that day, there's going to be some subjectivity already involved with that.
Yes.
But beyond that, when it gets beyond you giving me the information I need, and then you start to either twist it, because look, 24 hours over all these different cable stations, and they are in competition with each other, not just for this type of information, but for all the movie channels and all the sports and everything. They need eyeballs, and with those 24 hours, they have to fill it with something. So have a bit of a filter, but at the same time, be open enough that you are getting a taste or a sample of information from a number of different sources.
And I would jump on that only to add that anytime I see a panel, I'm already saying, okay, somebody's giving me their opinion if I have a panel. Because if it's actually the news, then I typically will have an anchor, maybe two anchors getting up there, and quickly, these are the top things that are happening. And as Lars said, a lot of that's already going to be, they've chosen what to tell you. That is, in media, we talk about framing, we talk about agenda setting. And the way I look at framing is that you would end up, anytime a reporter goes out to get a story, who they choose to interview, who they don't interview, the questions that they choose to ask, the questions that they don't ask, the opportunity to get responses or not. Are they adding a visual element or not? Especially for television, they've got to have a visual element in there. And radio, they have to have an audio element in there. You know, how are they putting all this together before it ever actually gets to the point where it goes into the news? And then once they go into the news, we start looking at agenda setting, where they're not telling you what to think, but they're definitely telling you what to think about. That is, we have the top news of the hour. We have the top story on the newspaper, for those of y'all who still read newspapers. We have the top story. We have the top story of the hour on in the radio as well, or on cable news. And so they more or less will rank those different stories based on how many news values they have. And we typically go and we get we teach students to get news based on news values. That is it timely? Is there impact? Is there conflict? Is it current? That is an ongoing situation. Is it unusual? Is someone prominent involved? Is it nearby because people care about more things that are happening in their backyard than they do halfway across the world as a rule? And so knowing that, that's how they're choosing what news to give you. And then based on which ones have the most appeal to their audiences will be typically how they choose in the order in which they give you.
Okay, very good. I think that leads us into the question I think a lot of people have, and you hear quite a bit about the idea of media bias, that the media are biased. It's one of the questions I think that was sent earlier is, are news media biased? And there's actually there's a project that will actually put people on or news organizations on a particular spectrum, right? Mm-hmm. And the spectrum can be from liberal to conservative. Does media bias exist? If so, why does it exist? And how can you pick up on particular biases that might exist in one news organization versus another? And by saying media bias, I want to be careful here in framing this conversation, because oftentimes there is this idea that the media are some kind of they, right? There's some kind of collective group and they're all making decisions together about what they want to. And we know from our own experiences that really it's a group of individuals who are making oftentimes individual decisions, and news organizations themselves have their own news values and their news judgments, and they're very, very different. And there are news organizations that could be lean a lot more conservative, and other news organizations that might lean a lot more liberal. But when we're talking about media bias, what does it look like? And in particular, why does it exist, and how can we identify it?
Well, first, I want to really applaud the fact that we're bringing this up. There is no the media. And when I hear that term and it gets used in arguments all the time, everything is so politicized, the media. No, there's a collection of media outlets. Mm-hmm. If you want to talk the wide, even in local news, if you flip back and forth between 2 or 3 TV stations, they're not going to have the exact same rundown. And they have meetings every day. What stories are we going to run? Which is going to be our top story? And as I said before, there's going to be some subjectivity in there. But as far as the producers, as far as the reporters are concerned, they're trying to tell the story. They're trying to tell as much of. In fact, I tell my students, have the story tell as much of itself as it can. Mm-hmm. You're not going to be able to drive the story in one way or another, because the facts are going to be the doggone facts. Find the sources to get your sound bites, to get your quotes from, get the information correct, and you better be able to back up where you got those facts from. Where did you get them from? Can you get another source to back up the truth for that? So when I hear a phrase like media bias, the first thing I bring up is there is no the media. There is no mass person who is dictating what every TV station, what every cable news network, what every newspaper, whatever radio station is going to do. But to answer the last part of your question, perception is reality.
Especially media.
Especially media. So if you have a number of people who believe in the media and believe in a media bias, to them that is real. And that is something that even as I'm sending my people off to cover stories, that's something to look at. Because there's nothing quite as frustrating as you telling a story or you covering a story. You have the people in there giving, on video or on audio, giving their point of view. And even though you're telling the story right down the middle, I hate looking at the comments online a lot of times, because someone in a good handful, no matter what the story is going to say, this is fake, it's biased that way. Why are you even covering this story? You're trying to do this and do that. So in that respect, sometimes you can't win. But I tell my students, leave your opinion out of it. I don't care about your opinion, have the story tell itself.
Yeah, and I will say, I would say that there's a bias to it's where the money's at. And just like I tell my students, if they're covering any sort of issue, you better follow the money. If you're looking at the media, you need to follow the money. For example, Rupert Murdoch was a liberal man who living in Australia, and he saw a opportunity in America to have a conservative news channel when there wasn't really a conservative news channel that we had that was national. And so, that's where the money's at. So when we start looking at a perceived bias, I would say that it's more, they're trying to find stories that will fit the demographic that they're trying to reach for the advertisers that want to reach that demographic. And I don't think that you ever have an intentional bias from a reporter. I can't say, of course, 100%, because we are human, and we choose certain people to interview. We choose certain things to talk about. But I think if you end up looking at issues over time, you will find that there's not really a liberal or conservative bent to this. It's more about, who did they speak with? What issues are they trying to bring to the attention of their particular audience, so their advertisers can reach them.
Okay, we're going to explore that. Oh, go ahead, Ron.
I was going to say another point that I'm glad Ron touched on. If you're going to talk about those type of decisions, you're talking about at the executive and ownership level. Those who are on the streets doing the job are going to try to keep those biases in check. But even with that, a person's own experiences, I wouldn't say bias, but it could have something to do with how they approach covering a story.
For sure.
Cultural differences, experiential differences. So that can have some shading as to how someone can cover it if they don't have any clue as to what they are covering, versus someone who has some background. They may have a leg up on being able to approach the story to begin with.
And I would add only one other thing to that, and that is, you're not going to do a story that your boss is going to fire you for, because you got to eat too. So, I mean, if you're doing something, for example, you've got, 6 companies that own the vast majority of the media that we encounter. And so if you're working for ABC and Disney owns you, you're not going to write a bad story about Disney, because if you do, they're not going to sign your check. And it really comes, it's as easy as that. So, I apologize.
Yeah, no, we're going to explore this topic about media economics here in just a little bit more depth. I want to say a couple of things also about the concept of bias. I think bias exists in every person, and Ron, you had mentioned it when you were talking about framing theory. I mean, framing theory is anytime any human being tells a story, right? They construct a story based on their understanding about the world.
Mhm.
Okay. And we're all limited in our understanding about the world and the way that we see things in the world. And so we frame things according to our understanding of the world. This is just basic human psychology. And since news is reported by human beings, not by robots, not yet, we don't have
Well,
artificial intelligence reporting all news at the moment. We do actually have artificial intelligence reporting news in some areas, particularly in sports. But for the most part, I'm trying to tell a story and I'm trying to figure out why it makes sense to me and why it should matter to my audience, right? And so I'm going to pick up on the values and pick up on the things that I think are important and are valuable. And sometimes we have blind spots. I mean, and I think all of us are learning how to improve those blind spots. Particularly, this has been true with reporting in a number of underrepresented groups. I think we're getting a greater awareness right now about Asian Americans and their experience in the United States and how they have been subject to a number of things that maybe we just didn't realize. And so a lot of times we have to, as members of news media, we've got to open up our minds a lot more, right? That's the responsibility. It's not to say that we're, because we're not going to be, you're not going to take the human element completely out of the reporting, but to be open-minded and to find sources that are going to represent different points of view and report on those different points of view is what the balance aspect or the balance goal of news media is. I may not be able to take my own biases out because, it's just almost humanly impossible. But again, this is why it's important, I think, for audiences to read different perspectives about the same issue, so they're getting different points of view related to that issue. There's a famous study that was conducted at the University of Florida. It was an experiment where they wrote an article and they had it calculated exactly balanced, okay? Same number of statements on both sides of the issue, down to the word, okay? Exact same number of words used for each argument, so on and so forth. So it was calculated mathematically to be a perfectly balanced article. And then, of course, in the experiment, they surveyed that, the people would identify whether they leaned more conservative or if they leaned more liberal, read the article, and then they evaluated the article. And not surprisingly, those who leaned more conservative said the article was biased liberally. And those who leaned more liberal said the article was biased conservatively.
and a lot of that will depend, who do you mention first and who gets the last word as well.
That's true. Right.
So
but
how
even
it's
then,
always put together.
well, actually they alternated. So they used different, just to take that out there, they alternated first and last and so on and so forth, and found the same effect, okay, across all of those. And what it amounts to is that as audiences, we also bring our bias to the reading and interpretation of news and information, right?
For sure.
So when we see things, we assume that anything that's written that corresponds with my worldview, with the way that I see things, well, that's just automatically truth. And anything that's not, okay, is automatically bias.
Right.
And so we disregard what we see that fits our framework. And okay, that's just, and then anything that we see that stands out from that, we see as bias. And so as news media try to provide more of a balanced perspective on things, a lot of people, if you lean left, you're going to see it as being conservative. If you lean right, you're going to see it as being liberal. So it's very much a challenge, but it's also, I think, part of what the audience, how the audience participates in interacting with news media.
And one of the things that we're,
Go
and I
ahead.
apologize, Brad, one of the things that we're trying to teach the students is, yes, you do have a bias. And just like if you've heard about, Alcoholics Anonymous, and they go through this 12-step program, they have to recognize that they have a problem before they can do anything with it. So the same thing when we're teaching as far as students, you have to recognize your own biases, and then you have to work against that by going out of your way to, for example, when we have different cultures, you've got to go out and you've got to get the people who are impacted by this issue. You've got to go out and get the people who are who would have strong feelings on any side of this issue, because there's not just two sides to any issue. Just like, if there's a car wreck, yeah, whoever's in the wreck, one person's going to say I was right and the other person's going to say they're right. But if you have somebody sitting on the side watching, they've got a view of it that neither person involved does. And so you have to find those sources as well who are outside looking in who can give you a little bit of perspective. And if you've done a good job, that, you know, you've gotten at least 3 to 5 sources on a story, maybe you're getting close to the truth. But if you're only using 1 source or only using 2 sources, then there's no way not to be biased in that story.
And on top of that, to a point that you made earlier, it's a very good reason why you need to have a collection of different points of views in your newsroom, in your executive board, on your editorial board. Because if everyone has the same experience, they grew up in the same town and they have the same points of view, they're going to miss a lot of those stories, or they're going to have, say, a skewed read on a potential story. So it helps to have those different points of views in the production meeting and in the editorial meetings, even as you are pitching story ideas or going out and covering something, because someone may see a piece of the story as a little more essential, or the age-old question, why is this even a news story? Because it doesn't conform to your point of view doesn't mean that across the board it's not going to be of some value to your audience.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I want to get into this conversation about, one of the questions that was sent was who really owns or controls the media, in the United States, and why do the media, what are their goals? What are they trying to accomplish? Well, one of the things I teach in my class, we have a class at Arkansas State called Mass Media and Modern Society, Mass Communication, Modern Society. It really is a media literacy course, to tell you the truth. I think the students come out of there much more wide open and understanding how the media operate. And we go through all different types of media. But one of the things that I teach them, one of the things I really want them to understand is one of the primary motivators for how the media behave is the revenue. These are money-making machines, okay? The media are in a capitalist environment. And so, in the United States, this isn't true for every country in the world. There are different media models, media operational models. But in the United States, the media are free from government control. The media are not owned by the government. The media are basically independent institutions that are operating to make money.
Yes.
They're engaged in the capitalist adventure as well. And so, just to do a little bit of backtracking, early media, when you talk about early media, you're talking about magazines and newspapers in the beginning of the United States. In the beginning, people paid for that information. Okay, you subscribe. Your subscription to a newspaper, your subscription to a magazine is what paid for that magazine. And so members of the news media wrote for their audience. They were really trying to find an audience who would want to pay for the content that they had, right? Then, of course, with Benjamin Day and the New York Sun in the 1930s, he found a way of making more money by, well, what if I actually got advertisers who wanted to reach these audiences as our country was beginning its industrial revolution, and more people are making more and more products and got to sell more products and so on and so forth. It's like, well, what if I just give all these advertisers access to my audience, and they pay for the access to my audience? And now the need is to grow your audience, but it's not necessarily because it's what your audience wants to know or needs to know from your information. It's because I've got advertisers who want to reach this audience, right? And it flipped the model, didn't it? It flipped the model that really has supported media and art in the United States, for the last almost 200 years, where the audience is no longer really paying for the content. It's the advertiser that's paying for the content. And so the audience really is the product for a lot of media. Okay, the old adage, if you're not paying for it, you're the product. Okay, and this is no more true than in social media, where we get social media absolutely free, right? We get all of that for free. We'll talk a little bit about social media here, to kind of conclude our conversation. But that whole model has really changed the way that our news media operate, hasn't it? Ron, earlier on, you had mentioned, Rupert Murdoch, who owns the Wall Street Journal and Fox News, among other things. But he also owns fairly liberal papers in England and in Australia. The idea is now what motivates media companies is to find an audience to sell advertisers to.
Yes.
Right. And so why do we see the content that we see, whether it's on Fox, whether it's on CNN, whether it's on MSNBC? They know who their audience is. They do a lot of research. Where there's a lot of money spent in media companies is on research of their audiences. They know who their audiences are. They know what their audience wants. And so they're trying to cultivate content that's going to capture that audience so that they can bring that audience to the advertiser who is really paying for the bill, who's really paying for the operation of the news media, right? What are your thoughts about this? And is it a broken model? One of the questions that was asked is, how will advertising change now because of the pandemic, and will we ever get back to normal? Now, I don't know what normal is for advertising anymore, whether that means that advertising will go back to supporting the legacy media. No, that's never going to happen. I mean, they're not going to go back and say, oh, you know what? We need to keep newspapers. We need to keep magazines. We need to keep radio stations and television stations alive. So we'll go ahead and advertise on that. They've found a more efficient way of reaching their audiences, primarily through digital and social media. It's not coming back, right? So is the model broken? That's the question I want to ask. Is the model, the advertising supported media model, is it broken? And if it's broken, is there a way to fix it?
I think that we started seeing the cracks in the model whenever the internet really took off in the late 90s. I mean, we've had the internet for a long time, but as far as, you know, and we're seeing it when you had the paywalls. Walter Hussman from the Democrat Gazette, among other things, Waco Media, he realized that he had to figure out some way to continue to pay the people who were going out to get this information. And with the advertisers more or less jumping ship, they weren't, I mean, at first the internet was like, wow, here's this cool new thing. But they haven't really stayed. The model that you were talking about doesn't really work now. Or I don't think it works. Maybe still on television, Lars, and you can jump in on that. But as far as print publications, as far as internet news sites, I don't think that it does work anymore. And I do think that as one of the questions was talking about, you know, do we need to worry about breaking up the companies that own all of these, the major companies that own? Yeah, but I'm not even sure that if we did that, I'm not sure the answer anymore. I do know that information is going to be shared, just like it's historically been shared everywhere. I know that there will be some people willing to pay for that and some people willing to pay a lot for that. But I think if we're not careful, we're going to get to a time when the people who can afford it will be able to get the information. And if you can't afford it, well, good luck with it. And if we're going to have a democratic society, that's dangerous, because if we don't have good information, how are we supposed to make informed decisions? And I don't really have the answer to that. I mean, I'm kind of watching it as everybody else is. But yes, I do think the model's broken.
I like to use a slightly different terminology. I mean, the old model was great for what it was, and what you have now is a phasing to a new model, and not everyone knows exactly what that new model is going to be. That transition is where a lot of people lose money, as an old model no longer fits the direction in which we are going. You mentioned the paywalls online. People quickly found out that new way of doing things wasn't going to work if people can go to another place and get the same stuff for free, or get something very close to it for free. There's been a couple of times I've tried to go to a newspaper and read an article, and then if you want to read the rest of the article, you must buy it. Never mind. It's either not that important, or I can get it somewhere else,
or I can clear my cache.
Yeah, I mean, there's ways to get around that. So what it is everyone collectively and also individually trying to find that new model. And right now the model is, as you've said before, the audience is what they are selling. They're putting out bait for us to give them the numbers, give them the eyeballs. They can show the advertisers, hey, I have X number of clicks and eyeballs on this content for this month. It's going to be worth this much to add your ad to my media outlet, no matter what it is.
But even that's kind of twisted. That is, Google has charged is charging advertisers based on if it's a click through. And yet for hundreds of years, if we put the ad in front of them and they saw the ad, even if they didn't call the place, actually, they still saw the ad. And that's what they were paying for, is the eyes that see the ad. So if we're not, if our media outlets aren't being paid for who's seeing the ad, but they're being paid for who's clicking through to that next spot, they're really not getting their money's worth. And it makes me question, why would the media outlets continue to give the advertisers that?
Because they're getting paid. It may not be as much as they would like for each one, but if that's a source of revenue, be it whether they saw it or whether they clicked through, like this thing is continually evolving. I mean, this conversation could sound a whole lot different in 5 years as new and improved ways of going about. I mean, we're all dollar signs at the end of the day.
So let's talk about where this is, really accelerated, this idea of making money off of reaching people, and that's in social media. Social media have been designed to keep your eyeballs on social media. And right now, the average amount of time that a person spends in social media is 2.5 hours a day. Okay, the average amount of time people spend on media that alone it jumped an hour average in 2020. I think we all know why, but it's now 13.5 hours. 13.5 hours of a waking day, which is about 16, 17 hours, okay, is spent with some form of media. 8 hours of that is with social or digital media, and 2.5 hours of that is just purely with social media, right? For the average person. It's not to say for everybody who's participating in this. So social media are especially designed. You have, program developers their entire job is how to keep you plugged in to my social media platform, whether it's TikTok or whether it's Instagram or Facebook. Facebook is still #1 worldwide in terms of how much time and people are connected to it, right? But they are designed to keep your eyeballs there. And how this is tied then into, this social hygiene is the algorithms, and probably many people are aware of this, but the algorithms are written as such that I'm going to give you content that you already look at and that I already know that you're interested in, right? Mm-hmm. And so these algorithms are written in such a way that they constantly feed us the same kinds of content that we're already consuming, thereby creating these rabbit holes where we dig down deep, right, and get lost in the information, and the echo chambers where all we see are the same kinds of content and information. We don't see anything that's different. It just reinforces what we've already seen. And it's not necessarily that the social media companies are inherently evil per se, for doing this. And the algorithms are just, mathematical calculations to predict human behavior. It's just, I want to keep your eyeballs on my screen so I can sell advertisers to you, right? The more time you spend in my social media platform, the more money I make with advertisers. And for the most part, it's a brilliant business model, by the way, because I don't have to produce any content. I create a platform, everybody else produces the content, I sell all the advertising.
Right.
Like, okay, this is perfect, right? Starting to change. And so some of the things are being brought up currently are, do we need to have regulation of these things? Do they need to be regulated, right? Maybe Jaron Lanier, who is a brilliant software developer. He's actually the one who created artificial intelligence, not artificial intelligence. Sorry, I forget. I apologize for saying that. he created, oh, I can't, well, I'll get to it. But anyway, he's basically said, we need to flip the model. The advertising model is not working. He needs to flip the model. People need to pay for it. If you pay for it, then you get the content that you need, right? Australia and New Zealand have just recently passed laws where the social media companies are going to have to pay for content. You know, they haven't had to pay for content, news media content, and that kind of stuff here in the United States. They're requiring them to pay for that content so they can actually generate revenue and funds for people whose livelihood it is to create content, because they're losing out as well. I mean, our news organizations are just shrinking, right? So we're getting fewer and fewer voices. We're getting fewer and fewer people who are actually generating that content, and we're getting, but the channels.
Well, as far as those companies, your traditional news media companies, there's this this two-pronged thing that's happening. To your point, more and more at this point in time, no one else in the history of humankind has had more choice or more control over the content they're going to be exposed to. Even as far as just television goes, you don't just have ABC, NBC, and CBS and maybe PBS anymore. You have, I don't know how many channels. You have all these different websites. So you have more choice now that you can narrow down to your particular interest. At the same time, you have so many people who aren't professionals, who have the tools in their own pocket where they can create media content that looks and sounds just as professional as those who have been trained to put forth news content and entertainment content, like any television station or network. So you don't have, say, the same filters as we used to have as far as coming out with true content. So there's just a vast universe of things to filter through, and at the same time, everyone who has access to a computer, to a phone, can really personalize just those things that's going to create the least amount of dissonance, that's going to make them feel comfortable, the messages they're going to be exposed to.
Yeah.
You used to have freedom of the press if you owned a press. Now everybody owns a press.
Right. And that's kind of one of the, the interesting paradoxes, right? We're creating all of these different, silos within our society, but everybody actually has more freedom to create and distribute content than ever before. We have more choices, right?
But we also have information overload. And, one of the things that if I personally have a complaint about the internet, it's not that I can't get things, because I can get anything I want and things I don't even want. But it's a matter of, you don't have, it's full time. It's just like the news cycle is 24/7 now. The information coming in is 24/7. And so people have a hard time turning off.
Yeah.
And then whenever they are on, especially, and I think there was just a study that came out the other day that's talking about, when people are sharing fake news, either they're not paying attention, or they're sharing something they think would hurt the side that they're against.
Yeah.
And so it's where there's no off button.
Well, we're winding down on our time here. And I mean, as we were preparing for this, we knew that it was going to be hard to kind of really address every single aspect related to media literacy, because, like I said, we teach a 15-week course on this, and we're trying to do this in an hour. A couple of things I just want to bring up that I know we had discussed would be important as part of this conversation. One, which you both have just alluded to, which is the concept of the active audience. One of the things that we tend to, there's a principle called the third person effect. We oftentimes believe that the media are much more influential on others than they are on ourselves, right? So, oh yeah, the media do all of this to other people, so on and so forth. The truth is we make choices ourselves. We are active audiences. We actively engage. We make the choices as to what media we want to use. And as Lars mentioned, we have more choices than we've ever had before, right? So we have needs, and we have desires, and we have, things that we want to have satisfied. in our lives. And we use media now more than ever, okay, to meet those needs and to meet those desires. And so as an active audience, I think one of the things that we need to do as a society, personally, I believe, is not only to possibly improve the operation of the media, news media outlets, and the way that they present information, and by golly, we need to fund true journalism a lot better than what we're doing right now. We're not funding it as a society, okay? If we want the news and the information, we've got to have people going out there and gathering it. And we're not doing that right now. So there's a dearth of really good quality information and news analysis. And people who can't afford it, as Ron, you mentioned, they're getting access to some really good sources, but it tends to cost them a little bit more, right? The stuff we get for free oftentimes isn't quite as good. So we need to improve ourselves as audiences. And there's a great book that was published in 1985 by Neil Postman entitled Amusing Ourselves to Death. He wrote it about television, and he was very, very concerned about the impact that television was having on audiences. He based the premise off of, 1985, the year after 1984. So George Orwell's 1984 was on everybody's mind, and where we're going to have this Orwellian dystopian future where books are banned and information is controlled and so on and so forth. And he said, actually, it probably is more closely to Aldous Huxley's A Brave New World. The concern that it's not going to be that there's not information, there's information control, there's going to be too much information. And much of that information is going to be pure trivia. And that it's going to appeal to the human nature to be distracted all of the time. Well, by golly, we have the most distractive things in the world now in these little devices right here. We are constantly distracted by the content that appears here, right? I just want to read, he said, that Orwell, people would be controlled by inflicting pain, but Huxley saw that in the Brave New World, we're going to be controlled by inflicting pleasure. Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. So we are active participants in the content that we receive because it's what we spend our time with, right? If we want to have better information as audiences, we need to spend more time with that information because then advertisers will support that. And I think we need to demand it as audiences, that we need better information and we don't need to be constantly distracted by maybe what Huxley would refer to as, the orgy-porgy or the centrifugal bumblebee, so.
But Brad, that means people are going to have to give up their Facebook. And honestly, I just don't, I gave mine up, but I know I'm in the minority.
Yeah. So just wanted to, some big ideas that maybe we can take out of this. What are some, I think maybe we could use a new Hutchins Commission. Maybe we ought to fund something that really looks at news and information in our society and how to improve it. What's the responsibility of this and how can we improve that? Because the landscape has just exploded recently, right? I think maybe we need to find a better funding model than advertising, for news and media information. What that model is going to be, as Lars mentioned, we don't know yet, right? But I think we know that we need to transition probably to a better model for funding news and information. And I think we need greater media literacy across all persons that are engaged in our democracy. And personally, I think it would be great as a required curriculum, either at the high school level, college level, or something like that. But if, I think it's that important for us to understand how media operate, why certain messages appear where they appear, how to break out of our echo chambers, how to make sure that we're not reading fake news, and how can we verify that. All of those things I think are really important tools. And so I think those are some things that we probably could, should look at trying to explore down the road.
And if I may add one last thing, that is, if we don't, then we really have to decide, hey, are we going to have a democracy?
And
we're going to have a democratic republic because it's getting questionable.
Yeah.
And if we are not getting, if everybody doesn't get good information, we cannot make good decisions.
Right. And that was actually, interestingly enough, that was the exact same question that faced the Hutchins Commission in the 1940s. They were doubting whether a democracy could survive. And the value of news and information in sustaining that democracy was the focus of their commission work, right? I think we've come full circle. We're back to where we were. And I think we need to answer some of those questions again today. But I think we all cherish our democracy. We all believe that it's the best political system in the world, but it requires work and it requires effort. And not only requires effort on the part of government and the part of media and others, I think it requires effort on the part of its citizens, right? We need to make better choices about what we're going to do and how we're going to operate as citizens. And that includes, breaking out of some of our bad informational hygiene habits. It's pretty easy, and I will admit, just as much as anybody, when you see something on social media and it just riles up your emotions, that, yeah, I think that same way about this person or this company or so on and so forth. It's easy to share that, right? Without first saying, okay, well, hold on. Let's see if this is true or not, right? Let's backtrack a little bit. Let's check it out. Oh, you know what? Turns out this is not true. I better not share it. It takes that kind of commitment because we're all participating in this information society today, much more than has ever happened in society before. So I think there's not only responsibility on news media and on government, but I think it's on its citizens as well. And we've got to learn how to improve ourselves. I'm going to pass it now back over to Taylor. I know I haven't left much time. Taylor, we've tried to address a lot of the questions that were submitted, but Taylor, anything else you would like to direct to us?
Yeah, absolutely. And y'all have done a terrific job at addressing a lot of the questions that were submitted. It's been a really fascinating discussion so far. I do want to put, if we can try to squeeze 2 quick questions in here, I do want to throw those to the panel. The first of which, it can kind of feel at times like might be more PR type professionals in the industry than journalists, if that makes any sense. Would y'all agree with that statement? And if so, or if not, how do you feel that kind of affects the industry as a whole? Let me know if that question doesn't make sense either. I'm not wording it very well as I'm speaking.
I think we're at a point where it's just as anybody can make news. I mean, everybody has a press. If you've got a WordPress site, if you've got a Wix site, if you've got a Weebly site, you can put what you want out there. And so I do believe we have more organizations who are putting out their own news and trying to bypass what would be the traditional news outlets. But I also believe that, your colleges and universities are really trying hard to put out people who know the difference. And I want to believe that most of your news organizations are working hard to hire those people who can tell the difference in order to give the information. And if they're not, I would like to believe that they're getting rid of them.
And I think Taylor, I think part of it is a result of our shrinking newsrooms. So if you've got a newspaper and you no longer have the advertising revenue that you need to keep all of your journalism employees, you're cutting back. Then you're reliant upon other sources of information. So there's a lot of news aggregation that goes on now, whereas you maybe would do your own reporting. You don't have a reporter who can cover that. So they're actually going out and looking at other news media and aggregating those stories and putting them into your paper. But it does open up the door for other professional communicators to get their content into a newspaper. Because if you're a newspaper, you have to remember what drives how many pages are in a newspaper or how many pages are in a magazine isn't how many news stories there are. It's how much advertising you've sold, okay? The advertising determines the size of your paper. That's why there's not less news happening in Jonesboro than there was 10 years ago, okay? But the paper has gone from 36 pages down to 12, all right? That's because of advertising, not because of lack of news of what's happening in our community. And so, yeah, it opens up the door. If I've got all this advertising, I've got to fill the space, and I don't have a lot of journalists because I can't keep them hired. It does open up the door for PR content and other kinds of content to come into the news platform.
And as far as the roles go, you're talking about taking information and packaging it up to send out to a mass audience. There are a lot of PR professionals who are journalists. There are a lot of journalists who have some background in PR. It's about what role they're fulfilling, what job they have at that particular time.
What's the next question, Taylor?
The next one and the last one, if we can try to address it quickly, I know we're a little after one here, is regarding the fairness doctrine and whether or not the panel feels like that should be brought back.
Yes.
I figured I could probably put that one to you as an easy yes or no answer, but
I think the principle of the fairness doctrine is one that what probably needs to be reestablished. I don't know if the actual operation of the fairness doctrine as it was in broadcasting, that, you know, if you had one person come on, you had to then give the equal amount of time and so on and so forth. But I think the principle of the fairness doctrine, that the media do have, I think, a sacred responsibility of keeping us informed and providing an outlet for a variety of different voices to come and share their information with society so that we can, I mean, the whole reason we have the First Amendment, it's based on Milton's concept of a free marketplace of ideas, that we shouldn't restrict ideas from coming out into the marketplace, but we evaluate those ideas based on their merit. And we hope, and we have hope that the best ideas win out based on their merit, not based on the fact that somebody didn't think they were popular or something like that. And so I think the fairness doctrine was focused on that to a certain degree. It's like, let other voices come out. Don't always just publish the one voice. To a certain degree, we really do. We kind of have that, as Lars already mentioned, we have that as active audiences in the choices that we make about what we want to watch. If I want to do a little bit of fairness doctrine in my own life, I can watch 10 minutes of CNN, 10 minutes of MSNBC, and 10 minutes of Fox, okay? I'm going to get different perspectives on the same story in each of those 10 minutes. It's there. Those different perspectives are already out there in the media landscape. I think that's why as audiences, we give too much power to a single source if that's our only source of information about what's going on in the world. We need to be smarter audiences and open up our minds and watch different and consume different kinds of content. That would be my response to it.
Lars, you got to come in there because, I mean, you're the broadcast guy.
Well, the idea of it, yes. I don't know exactly how that would get executed in this day and age with so many choices, and then how you're going to execute it as far as, and usually when you think of the fairness doctrine, you think in terms of political coverage. Well, there's more than just Republicans and Democrats. Yes. How are you going to divvy up that time? How are you going to say they got so many minutes, they got so many minutes? If every media outlet practiced some form of that doctrine, that would take care of it. If you're talking about having, say, an FCC, which doesn't cover cable, try to cover all of that. I don't know exactly how it's going to be done, but in idea, yeah, there should be some of that practice, because really that's the source of a lot of the misinformation that we have now that's preached as gospel. This is my team. This is the color I'm wearing. The flag I'm waving, the color I'm wearing. So these are good guys. These are bad guys. We're going to ignore those over there. It would be better if we had some form of the doctrine. I just don't know exactly how that's going to get executed.
Yeah.
Devil's in the details, as they say. So awesome. Well, guys, I know we are about 5 minutes after one, but I want to thank our panel for joining us today. It's been a fascinating conversation. I know I'm walking away with some good information that will help me be better at finding good information and practicing better information hygiene. I hope that everybody who joined in feels the same way. Before we sign off, I do want to share a few different events that we're going to have coming up. Next Friday on April 16th, the Alumni Association is going to be hosting our Bark at the Park event at the Tom. So come on out that evening, bring your furry four-legged friends and have a great time. Stop by the alumni tent with your current membership card and you'll be able to get a free giveaway. In addition to that, on May 12th, we're very excited to host A-State's new athletic director, Tom Bowen, at our next Lunch and Learn event. So keep an eye out for that as we open up registration. That one is sure to be a really great conversation. We're excited to have him here on campus and to be able to present him to you in our next Lunch and Learn event. And last but certainly not least, Arkansas State University is thrilled to be hosting our A-State Day of Giving in a few weeks on April 27th. And this is going to be a day-long celebration of giving and philanthropy at Arkansas State. I'd ask you all to please mark your calendars and consider finding a passion that you might have on campus and making a gift in support of that passion on that day, April 27th, Give to A-State. So thank you all again, everybody, for joining us. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Stay safe.
You too.
Yep.
What's up?
Wolves up. There we go. Yeah.